There is this deeply ingrained story we're always told about family separation and adoption. It's almost always wrapped in the language of protection, right? It's framed as this benevolent, heroic act of rescue. But there is a growing rupture in that public narrative. Adoptees themselves are completely dismantling it, bringing forward a rigorously austere question that sits at the very heart of this explainer. What if the system itself is the harm? Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we are unpacking a really powerful structural critique derived straight from the Substack publication Thoughtless Delineation by Shane Boole. And just to set expectations, this isn't a conversation about sentimentality or personal feelings. It's a forensic autopsy of what the author calls the subscription identity. We're going to strip away the public relations narratives to examine the systemic realities of the adoption industrial complex. We'll look closely at the exact mechanisms of identity erasure, and this really wild paradox of how a state can legally erase your biology while the market simultaneously monetizes it.
Okay, let's dive into this. Section 1, the architecture of silence.
To really understand this architecture of silence, we have to look at a hidden legal mechanism termed genealogical nullification. When an infant is adopted, the system doesn't just, relocate a child or create dual belonging. According to the source, it performs a much deeper act of foundational violence. It physically seals the original birth certificate and issues an amended birth certificate. And this amended document, it's described as a legal fiction that falsely lists the adopted parents as the biological parents. So the system doesn't integrate a person's origins, it permanently overwrites and replaces them. The author argues that this creates an ontological closed loop. From the exact moment that certificate is reissued, the individual exists in a state of administrative dislocation. Their origins absolutely still exist, but they are entirely controlled by the state. This results in what the source calls a subscription identity. It's basically a conditional existence, where the state controls your history, and you are effectively participating in an identity structure that requires you to continuously surrender your past just to belong to your present. Moving right along to Section 2, the map, which deals with statutory fictions. And this brilliantly illustrates a stark contrast between what the legal system dictates and what biological reality actually is. The source frames this core conflict as the map versus the territory. So the map represents the institutional framework, the statutory fictions, the legal permanence of the amended birth certificate, and this blank slate theory that simply assumes a human being can be seamlessly overwritten. But the territory is the visceral, molecular reality of the adoptee. It's defined by relational permanence and what the author coins the identity gravity well. Think of it as a dynamic biological field of force that inevitably pulls an individual back toward the subsonic truth of their physical origins, absolutely no matter what the legal paperwork says. Imagine trying to navigate your entire life using a legally fabricated source code. The friction between the map and the territory is just immense. As the author states, adoption is the ontological and epistemological fault line of colonial psychology. The source material argues that by forcing the map onto the territory, the system actually enforces a lifelong spiritual and experiential neurodivergence upon survivors, basically demanding they navigate the world using that fabricated framework. Let's move to Section 3 and see how this builds regulatory capture and capital. If the legal fiction is the how, the author urges us to look at the why. The source breaks down this vertically integrated syndicate. While organizations like the National Council for Adoption take a very public stance of child welfare, the structural reality, according to the forensic audit provided in the text, is that they function as an industry protectionist syndicate. Private agencies frame their work as rescue and placement, but mathematically their revenue is entirely dependent on families' separation. The author claims this system fundamentally optimizes for processing the fragmentation of families rather than preventing it, simply because separation generates actual allocatable revenue. So the crucial point here is exactly how they protect this market. The text outlines precise mechanisms of regulatory capture. This includes a revolving door, where industry lobbyists transition directly into federal oversight roles. It features a governance board dominated by the very agency's CEOs who benefit financially from placement volume. It highlights the adoption tax credit, which uses taxpayer dollars to subsidize consumer demand for infant acquisition. And it points to legislation like the Adopt Act, which the author argues was utilized to criminalize independent competition and literally force all traffic back into licensed agency pipelines. To put that into perspective with some specific data, the author highlights a $324,160 federal grant awarded to train hospital staff in options counseling, The source argues this effectively deputizes medical professionals. It transforms hospital maternity wards, which are sites of acute emotional vulnerability, into logistical intake nodes for private capital. Which brings us back to the body. Section 4. The territory. Biological reality. Now, what's really interesting here is the staggering paradox we encounter: the total erasure of biological history versus the highly lucrative extraction of data. The author calls this the default error. In our digital age, the incredibly complex qualitative trauma of human displacement is aggressively compressed into quantifiable, monetizable data points. The text contrasts the deep philosophical concept of qualia, the irreducible feeling of navigating a biological void, with Qualia Labs, a billion-dollar venture-backed software company. The algorithms optimize for the corporate entity, automatically burying the human reality. This is what the source calls epistemicide, the algorithmic erasure of marginalized histories for pure market efficiency. But this erasure completely ignores the heavy mathematics of biology. The source provides a molecular timeline called the epigenetic risk architecture. Starting right from day one of systemic severance, the body reacts. Within the very first year, there is hypomethylation of the FKBP5 gene. Through adolescence, we see hypermethylation of the BDNF promoter regions, which constrains neuroplasticity. And into adulthood, this results in a permanent state of chronic hypervigilance. The author's argument is unyielding here. Displacement creates a physical, lifelong injury that is mapped directly onto human DNA. So this isn't just some psychological hurdle to get over. The biological proof of trauma is structural. The text points to the loss of the cortisol chemical handbrake. That basically means the nervous system is forced to run continuously on emergency power. It alters spatial sequence reasoning, creating this profound feeling of being geographically lost. It even manifests in emotional photism, a specific sensory alteration where immense internal distress translates into the physical environment appearing literally dimmed or hostile to the person. The body remembers what the state tries to erase.
This leads us to the final part of our analysis, Section 5, Sovereign Inquiry and Agency.
The text absolutely does not stop at the open wound. It turns directly toward reconstruction. To combat this institutional gaslighting, the source proposes a framework called the Cytoic Protocol. It's presented as the ultimate tool for what is termed sovereign inquiry. It operates in 3 tiers. First, monitoring biological stress markers and spatial liminality. Second, using neuroimaging to identify how the brain categorizes threats when it's entirely devoid of biological mirrors. And third, utilizing genomic research to map subjective adoption trauma directly onto objective DNA patterns. Essentially, it validates the neuroplasticity of the displaced right up against the amnesia of the institution. This transition from being a passive, legally erased subject to becoming an active agent is captured perfectly in this incredibly powerful quote from the author. Shane Paul Buell is what happens when institutional amnesia grows a nervous system and starts writing back. It represents the absolute refusal to perform the expected role of the compliant, grateful adoptee, just for the convenience of a system that was built on their erasure. Moving from personal agency to actual systemic reform, the source outlines specific forensic demands for structural evolution. This includes the strict enforcement of UNCRC Article 8, which is the right to identity. It demands forensic auditing of child welfare institutions to expose the capitalization of family separation. It calls for the abolition of the clean break legal fiction and the implementation of accessible, no-fault, no-fee adoption discharges. As the author notes, true justice requires distinguishing between what is legally correct on paper and what is structurally just in reality. Ultimately, this entire explainer distills down to one fundamental human right: the right to exist without being rewritten. Think about what that actually means for a moment. This matters because it challenges us to look at how systems use bureaucratic abstraction to define who belongs and who gets erased. It asks us to recognize that human truth originates in ancestry and continuity, definitely not in state-sanctioned paperwork. So, I want to leave you with this final, really provocative thought from the source material. Every system keeps a ledger. Are we prepared to dismantle the comforting mythologies of rescue and benevolence to finally read the ledger of human truth? If this analysis has sparked your curiosity, and I really hope it has, I highly encourage you to continue your focused learning. You can explore the deep structural reality of this entire topic by reading the full thesis on the Thoughtless Delineations Substack. It's a truly fascinating read.